And Adam, it is noon. Take it away, please.
Thank you, Maura. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Levine, and I am Executive Director here at the New York Metropolitan Transportation Council, or NYMTC. As the region's metropolitan planning organization, NYMTC provides a collaborative planning forum to address transportation-related issues and develop regional plans through our members' shared vision for the transportation network that connects New York City, Long Island, and the Lower Hudson Valley. I thank you all for participating in today's Brown Bag webinar. For any certified planners in our audience, this presentation is eligible for one certification maintenance credit from the American Planning Association. You'll find more information about this in the chat. Today, we are very excited to have a presentation from the New York City Department of Transportation on its New York City Pedestrian Mobility Plan. New York City is a city of pedestrians who rely on an interconnected network of sidewalks and street crossings. New York City DOT has developed a holistic, data-driven framework to identify pedestrian needs and provide design guidelines that will inform how we design our sidewalks and streets. The New York City Pedestrian Mobility Plan presentation will discuss details about the plan and how the pedestrian unit envisions using it. Our speakers from New York City DOT today are Carissa Lidstrand, Planning Team Lead, and Amy Howden Chapman, Project Coordinator. We may also, I didn't check, but I hope we are also joined today by their colleagues Tara Ishii, Director, and Heidi Wolf, Deputy Director, all with the New York City Department of Transportation Pedestrian Unit. There will be an opportunity for questions following the presentation, so please type your questions into the WebEx chat box and we will address them during the question and answer portion towards the end. I will now turn it over to Carissa Lidstrand. Carissa?
Good afternoon, everyone. My colleague Amy is actually going to start the presentation. Take it away.
Hey, everyone. Yeah, thanks, Carissa. And I'll just ask you to advance the slides if they're not advancing. Carissa's in charge there. Okay, so thank you so much for the introduction. Yeah, Carissa and I are going to go through the plan, how we developed it, how it guides our thinking and our work, and we look forward to your questions at the end. Next. To start with, we'd really like to thank NYMTC for funding this plan. We've been working on this plan for over 4 years. We started prior to the pandemic, and then as our kind of work implementing projects really slowed down at the height of the pandemic, we were able to, as a team, really focus on developing this plan when we were stuck at home, and NYMTC funding was vital in that development. And we were able to create this plan all in-house. Other plans like this often use consultants, but we were able to do it all in-house at the pedestrian unit. Yeah, next. So why a pedestrian mobility plan, or why not? We know that we have plans in New York City for buses, the Better Bus Action Plan, the Green Wave Plan for cyclists, we have a freight mobility plan, and many other cities have pedestrian plans. In formulating this plan, we looked at Portland's plans, Oakland's plans, as well as overseas plans like London's walking plan. But in New York City to date, we haven't had a pedestrian plan. And in fact, we think of ourselves as a city of walkers, of fast walkers even, right? And that reputation is based on fact. 31% of trips are walking only trips in New York City. That's the most of any transit mode. And the start and end of lots of other trips also involve walking, you know, be it walking from the subway to your house, walking from a city bike station to work, walking from a grocery store to your parked car. We're walking all the time in New York City. And in fact, the thing about walking being so ubiquitous in New York City might be, we think, one of the reasons why walking has been overlooked as a planning mode to date. But just like cars and bikes, having the appropriate infrastructure for walking really impacts the quality of the experience and how likely people are to walk more, which is what we're hoping for. So Thinking about the quality of a walking experience is something the NYC pedestrian plan is really focused on. The safety of walking is something that the DOT has concentrated on a lot in the past, and something we continue to prioritize through Vision Zero initiatives. And there are also basic accessibility guidelines that govern our pedestrian infrastructure and our public spaces through ADA, Americans with Disability Act. But this plan seeks to go further, further than ADA. We're hoping to develop metrics for pedestrian comfort and convenience. You can see that highlighted here on the graphic. It's a priority of this plan, and the aim is to develop design standards for pedestrian facilities across the city that will lead to that greater comfort and convenience, and hopefully ultimately more enjoyable walking. Okay, to sum up some of the broad goals and purpose of this plan before Carissa and I get more into the nitty-gritty of how we developed it and what it consists of, that the plan aims to make walking more desirable and increase walking mode share. We think that's incredibly important in this era of climate crisis, and also given that walking, we know, improves physical and mental health. The plan categorizes streets based on pedestrian generators. We'll get more into that. And street categories have corresponding design guidelines. The pedestrian mobility plan seeks to develop projects that increase pedestrian comfort and convenience. And it also offers us a way to prioritize projects based on safety, equity, and pedestrian demand. We know there's a lot of work to do to improve New York City's pedestrian infrastructure, but we can't do all of that work tomorrow. So where do we start? So what is the walking mode share currently in New York City? Where are we at now? And what are some of the barriers to walking that prevent walking being comfortable and convenient? Obviously, walking experiences vary greatly across New York City. It's not a monolith, but we see here that a majority of in say Manhattan, a majority of walking, 80 to 90% of commuting is done by walking, and in many parts of Brooklyn and the Bronx, that's also really high, 70, 80%. However, I'm always struck by how even in parts of the city where we know folks are more dependent on vehicles because of land use typology or less access to mass transit, there's still a really relatively high number of walking trips. We see here that in outer Queens, around a quarter of trips are still walking trips, but even, or as we get to middle Queens, it very quickly jumps up to over a third of trips being primarily walking trips. Great. Okay, so because of that variation across the city, the pedestrian mobility plan doesn't try and have one size fits all solutions, but rather look at different needs. So different walking goals for different neighborhoods based on walking rates, on geographic factors, and on socio-demographic variables. So we see, so for say Manhattan and then Brooklyn, and our aim is to reduce pedestrian reduce pedestrian congestion, and really ensure that right-of-way allocation reflects the modal split of users. Moving a bit further out, from mid-Brooklyn and Queens and chunks of the Bronx, the goal is to increase the number of pedestrian trips taken in New York City. So really get walking up in furtherance of the citywide health and emission reduction goals. And then moving to the outer boroughs, our aim is to ensure pedestrian infrastructure is safe, is comfortable, and really reflects the needs of the users who are walking in those places. finally, there are parts of New York City that are lacking very basic pedestrian infrastructure. So think no sidewalks at all, or maybe sidewalks, say, on just one side of the street. So in Staten Island and in other parts of the outer boroughs, our goals are more centered on the development of a fully built out pedestrian network. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with some of these struggles around New York City. So to illustrate here some of the barriers of walking that New Yorkers face, we have missing sidewalks or sidewalks with without adequate width, or sometimes with internal obstructions that restrict movement, trash cans, trees, this kind of thing. We also have sidewalks with insufficient width just because of the density or the volume of users. Think any, busy sidewalk you walk down where you're tempted to just step onto the street and walk for a few steps because you can't get past all the folks there. But being able to walk, and we can also see kind of lack of crossings as a barrier to walk in. Being able to walk comfortably and conveniently down the sidewalk is one thing, but being able to cross the street safely and conveniently is also a really key part of pedestrian infrastructure. So these are some of the barriers, and then we have a different mix of physical and policy solutions. So it can be as simple, although as expensive, as putting in a new sidewalk. Then we also have the ability to expand sidewalks. We can do this in either paint or concrete. We call this image here is of 8th Avenue. This is what we call a super sidewalk. We can reconstruct sidewalks and remove obstructions, and we can add crossings. Controlled crossings and crosswalk markings. All right, now I'm going to hand it over to Carissa for the next section.
All right, thank you, Amy. We've been talking a lot about how New York City's streets are all so different. And so one of the questions we started asking ourselves when creating this plan was, how can we use data to show where there are a high number or low number of pedestrians throughout the city? And while we could collect pedestrian volume throughout the city, that would be very expensive to do so. And we would have to do it yearly for the data set to not be static. Because as we know, New York City is constantly changing. There's development happening in different areas. So we want to be able to create a data set that reflects that time. And so we started thinking about what are the current kind of data sets and metrics that we have that think about pedestrians. And we were reflecting a lot on how pedestrians are oftentimes left out of modeling. We think a lot about how vehicles need to get from point A to point B, but oftentimes pedestrians are left out of this thought process. So we can see that in some of the images on the right, where there are inadequate pedestrian infrastructure, or there's no crossings at all, or there are barriers where there should be a crossing. So these are just some of the things that we had started to think about and kind of guided us to this idea of categorizing our streets based on pedestrian demand. And then we could go on to develop design guidelines based on that. And we did draw a lot of our inspiration by looking at other cities. We looked within the United States, also internationally, to see what other cities were doing. And we got a lot of insight from Portland, Oregon, who, when they developed their pedestrian plan, looked at categorizing their streets. And so that's kind of the approach that we decided to take with our analysis. But before beginning that process, we wanted to step back and ask ourselves, like, what is the use of the sidewalk? Like, we work for the New York City Department of Transportation, so we typically think of walking as a mode of transportation, but we know that the sidewalks are more than just that. They're also meeting places, they're commerce, they're areas where you could people watch. They play a lot of different uses. And so while we recognize that, we do want to focus on walking and making that both comfortable and convenient for people throughout the city. And so that's what we started with when developing our plan. And so we categorized New York City streets into 5 different categories. As you can see here, baseline is the lower category and global being the higher. Baseline streets are kind of where you see a lot of lower residential in the outer boroughs, mostly single family homes, not a lot of pedestrian generators in this area. We also were thinking about from the aspect of comfort and convenience, like what it feels like to walk on these types of sidewalks. And so baseline might be where you're walking by yourself, but you're still able to comfortably pass by someone if they're coming the other direction. And then moving up to community connector, this is where you start to see a little bit higher density of residential. You might also see a small park or a lower enrollment school. But this is where if you're walking with a friend and you pass by someone, you still feel comfortable on that sidewalk. And then moving up to a neighborhood corridor, this is where you start to see a lot more commercial uses. And then the parks might get larger and the school enrollment might get higher. And this is where you might see small groups of people wanting to pass by each other, but still wanting to feel comfortable walking in that space. And then regional corridor is even more density of commercial. This is where you start to see more subway lines interchanged, and you see larger groups of people walking with one another and then past each other. The photo of the regional corridor here is Fulton Street in downtown Brooklyn, if you're familiar with that. There's a lot of commercial in that area, as well as a lot of new residential housing. And then global corridors is where corridors have a lot of regional uses, but it's very concentrated in an area, and it's really this destination. And you have like mass transit hubs, you have very large groups of people, tends to be a lot of where like tourists come to. A lot of Midtown Manhattan is global, but there are global streets in the outer boroughs, which I'll get into in a second. So this is just a breakdown of all of the ways that we came up with the 5 categories and what went into it. So if you're really interested in the data, this is for you. Some of the fun things to kind of point out is one piece that wasn't included in the original demand map, but we are editing that now, is under community connector. We're adding regional rail, so Metro North and Long Island Railroad, to really capture where those community connector streets are, mostly in the outer boroughs. So that's been something exciting that we've been editing, because this is, as I mentioned, we don't want this to be a static document. We want it to change, and we want it to get better and be just a good resource for everyone. And then if you look at the regional corridor section, that's where you can really see how we broke down like the percentage of office space in retail, as well as restaurants. And then you can see that the regional corridor versus neighborhood fluctuates with like subway ridership numbers. So those are just a few of the points, like how we differentiated between each category. The image on the right is kind of a snapshot of the data set in downtown Brooklyn. You can see that there's this cluster of regional corridors, and then as you go out, like the quarter mile, half mile kind of buffer from there, you start to see more neighborhood corridors in green, and then the blue community connectors. So everything kind of connects and funnels into one another. You can also see on Flatbush Avenue, there's a few blocks of a global corridor, and this is centered around the Barclays Center, which is a very large destination. Also, a lot of housing clustered around that area. These are just some examples of the data. And then to kind of look citywide and see the breakdown, really most of the city is baseline or community connectors. About 15% of the city is neighborhood, regional, and global. And some of the global, as I mentioned before, are in Midtown, but they're also in places in the outer boroughs. Might be a little hard to see here, but 125th Street in Manhattan is also a global corridor. We have Main Street in Flushing, also global. And then as I mentioned before, we have Flatbush Ave in downtown Brooklyn, which is also global. So there's a good mix of street categories in each of the boroughs. And so this demand map really is the starting point for other data sets and design guidelines that we've been wanting to look at. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Amy to talk through how the demand map now informs the design guidelines.
Thanks, Carissa. Yes, so onto the anatomy of a sidewalk. So thinking through just the next slide. So thinking through the anatomy of a sidewalk, this is part of our plan, and it's a way for us to designate three, at times, overlapping categories. So here we have the furnishing zone, the walk lane, and the clear path. And I want to emphasize again here that through these conceptual categories, we're looking to go kind of above and beyond the basic affordances of ADA. So yeah, above and beyond just those very narrow passing things that ADA requires. So, okay, the furnishing zone. This is the section of the sidewalk between the curb and the walk lane that does not primarily accommodate pedestrian movement in which amenities can be placed. So we see here a tree pit, that there's many other things we know. Then we have the walk lane. That's the portion of the sidewalk that accommodates pedestrian movement, and the walk lane includes the clear path, and it can also include appropriately spaced amenities, which allow for pedestrians to flow between them. And finally, we have the clear path. That's the portion of the walk lane that is totally free from amenities, and it's for that kind of uninterrupted pedestrian flow. I think it's useful to think about an analogy here of the road bed. Obviously, we're concerned with the sidewalk, but if we think about a roadway, you may have on a roadway a bike lane, a driving lane, and a parking lane, right? In the case of the sidewalk, the clear path is for pedestrians what that driving lane is for vehicle users. It's that zone for moving, it's that zone for really getting places. On the roadbed or the roadway, ideally you won't have vertical elements, another parked car in that driving lane. And on the sidewalk, we don't want vertical elements, be they a sandwich board or a pile of trash. We don't want those blocking pedestrian through movement. All right, and we take this anatomy of the sidewalk and we pair it together with the corridor categories, and then we get sidewalk guidelines. These are not regulatory, but they are kind of ideals that are helping us plan. The recommended width of the sidewalk varies by corridor category based on functional use, you can see here. So from a baseline street where the clear path is relatively narrow, around 4 feet, and as Carissa talked about, the kind of functional experience of a baseline street, you may have 2 people walking side by side, but anything else would be a little tight. And then we go right up to the global corridor where we have a really wide walk lane, 20 feet or more, and then also a really wide clear path, 15 feet or more. And again, as Carissa mentioned, the global corridors are really places where we have tens of thousands of people visiting a day, and these guidelines are really trying to accommodate those vast number of pedestrians. It's, I think, important to note that the furnishing zones also increase as the corridor, with the corridor categories. We know that the needs of a furnishing zone on baseline street might be quite different from the needs of a furnishing zone on a global corridor. A global corridor might have a subway entrance or exit, a subway elevator. But we know that all New York City streets have fire hydrants, tree pits, etc. So we always want to keep that in mind with the finishing zone widths. Thinking a little bit more through amenity zones. Obviously, we need amenities, and they really affect the comfort and convenience of walking too, whether it be the shade from trees, the ability to sit in a bus shelter on a rainy day waiting for a bus, wayfinding, concession stands. They all add to our experience of the street. However, amenities, while they can enhance the streetscape and enliven a kind of our pedestrian realm, our experience of walking, they do sometimes disrupt that basic pedestrian flow, that pedestrian movement. So getting this balance right is one of the key aims of our plan. Since walk lanes are where people are moving, amenities can be present in this space, but they should be limited. So it's great to have trees, but we do not want a wall of trees, right? We don't want a wall of planters. One kind of way I think it's useful to think through the difference between the walk lane and the clear path and the furnishing zone is think about a day in New York City where it's just snowed, right? A clear path has been shoveled out. We know there's a clear path where we can walk, but there's snow heaped on either side, right? If we don't have the ability because of that snow to kind of duck in and around other pedestrians, it feels very confining. And that's that kind of experience is what we don't want, on an everyday day. And that's why we want appropriate spacing of amenities in the walk lane and in the furnishing zone. All right, and now I'm going to hand it back to Carissa.
Great, thanks, Amy. So while we've been developing the pedestrian demand map as well as the design guidelines, we've also been thinking about what other pedestrian infrastructure data sets do we want to help really inform the other goals that the pedestrian mobility plan has. And really, we want to think about other data sets to inform where the pedestrian unit is doing work, but also to help other units within New York City DOT plan for better pedestrian environments, but also maybe other agencies to help inform their work. So we've been thinking about additional data sets that we want to create or explore with others to really hone in on where we can add better pedestrian facilities. And so the demand map has actually been really helpful, as well as the design guidelines, in helping us create a few data sets centered around where there might be narrow sidewalks throughout the city. So this is looking at existing sidewalk widths and if they meet our pedestrian mobility plan design guidelines or not. And if they are narrow, like what kinds of treatments could we do in these areas? And so one example is 7th Avenue in Manhattan. The photo below shows the improvement that we made, adding a painted sidewalk extension, which we are calling super sidewalks, to provide more space for pedestrians to flow. And then you have on the right a snapshot of the data set, and the blue lines are showing the narrow sidewalks along 7th Avenue, and this is where we ended up putting in the super sidewalk. Another data set that we've been thinking about is where we can maybe prioritize curb extensions based on like high pedestrian volume. So thinking about maybe like a neighborhood corridor or higher intersecting with another neighborhood corridor or higher, and seeing if those could be good locations to add curb extensions. Maybe there's an additional like sidewalk width deficiency there, or maybe there's been some Vision Zero crashes at that location that might prioritize that curb extension. So those are some of the things we've been thinking about as we've developed the demand map. In addition, we've also been thinking about other data sets that enhance pedestrian access, like long crosswalk distances, like trying to figure out where we could shorten those, where there might be a lack of sidewalks throughout the city. And then another thing that we've been wanting to look at more is complex intersections. This is where we have an intersection where there's at least 5 streets that come together, or this could be intersections that have like obtuse or acute angles that we want to prioritize, because these intersections tend to have either missing crosswalks or really long crosswalks. So this is an example in Upper Manhattan on St. Nicholas Avenue and 165th Street. We have a before photo on the left of a complex intersection, and then an after photo on the right, where we added some painted extensions and added some crossings to facilitate the direct path that pedestrians were flowing along St. Nicholas. So these are just some things that our team has been thinking about in addition to the demand map and the design guidelines to really help inform where we're working and how we're prioritizing our work in the city. And so I'll get into a little bit of that now, how we're thinking about identifying projects. And taking a little step back, historically, our unit has been very request driven, meaning that we've had a lot of like 311 type requests or arts requests that come through, and that might just be a single person asking for an upgrade at their intersection. And the map on the right shows where our concentration of work has been recently. And the red shows, you know, a higher concentration of projects, whereas the blue shows a lower concentration. And so, you know, we've been talking a lot about how this isn't a very comprehensive way to plan projects or very equitable. It doesn't meet a lot of our goals today. And so this plan, the pedestrian mobility plan, has really been great at helping us strategize on how we can shift to be more comprehensive and equitable in our work. And so these are a few of the ways that our team is now identifying projects. One of them is called comprehensive neighborhood analysis. And this is something we've created recently, and I'll get into a little bit more on the next slide. But project scope identified by others. This is typically where either an internal unit at DOT or an agency, a city agency like the Department of Environmental Protection, DEP, gives us a scope that they have for like a water main project, and then we see if there's any synergies with pedestrian improvements there. So that's usually like a scope is already identified, and we're helping to enhance the work at the same time that someone else is doing work. And then we also receive requests through the Department of City Planning related to rezoning and thinking about the pedestrian environment from those stages, as well as mayoral initiatives. And then something that we've been doing for a long time is coordinating with the Parks Department on adding new sidewalks or better crossings to park entrances or playgrounds. And so thinking about that more strategically is something that we're interested in. And so getting a little bit more into the comprehensive neighborhood analysis, something that we've wanted to do is look a little bit more holistically at areas. since we were so request driven, that was really focused on sometimes just one intersection or a small corridor. And we really want to take a step back and look holistically at like a neighborhood level. So the Department of City Planning has neighborhood population areas, which is a similar size to neighborhoods, but it's based on census tract boundaries. You can use a lot of demographic information within NTAs. And so we decided to use that as kind of our geographical boundary and layer in some of our priorities from the pedestrian mobility plan to really prioritize where we might want to start looking to identify projects. And the way we would identify projects is using all of the data sets that I was just referencing in the infrastructure mapping, as well as the pedestrian demand map. And so some of the goals that we have are looking at where there are New York City streets plan equity tiers, Vision Zero areas, thinking about safety throughout the city, and then also looking at a metric that focuses on comfort and convenience. So thinking about all of the different barriers to walking, and we always think of highways as one of those barriers, whether you have to walk over a highway or under it. You know, highways tend to bisect neighborhoods. You need to get to your commercial corridor on one side or the other. So thinking about kind of these auto-oriented infrastructure data sets, this could also include different land uses like surface parking lots, gas stations, or car washes. That's included in this data set. And then also factoring in pedestrian demand, so using the demand map as a layer as well. And so the map on the right shows the NTAs by priority level. The deep purple is the highest priority. And then the kind of tannish color is the lower priority. And so you can see that the high priority is distributed pretty well throughout the city. We also have a lot of medium high in a lot of different areas as well. And so our thought is that we would start looking at these areas more comprehensively and trying to develop our own ideas for projects and then coordinate with communities to see if this is in line with what their priorities are as well. And so to wrap things up, creating this plan has come at a very unique moment for rethinking pedestrian needs. You know, Amy mentioned that we started this plan basically at the start of the pandemic, which was a very interesting time to be thinking about pedestrians. That was when DOT started thinking about open streets. There's an example on the bottom left of the 34th Avenue open street in Queens. This is where we added barricades at the end of the streets, but allowed local access for vehicles, but pedestrians and bikes could flow freely through here. 34th Avenue is also in an area where there's not a lot of large parks. And so some use this as recreation, as well as, you know, whenever you get out of school and you want to walk home, like it's also as a form of transportation. And then, you know, we're also in this period of the climate crisis, Black Lives Matter movement, and environmental justice concerns. But thinking about how we're prioritizing upgrades to our pedestrian infrastructure is really important right now. And so the images on the right are an example of Mosholu Parkway in the Bronx, which is kind of a highway type environment that bisects a neighborhood. There are schools on both sides of the parkway, as well as commercial corridors that people walk to and from, as well as the subways. And so this is an area where we took away a few lanes of traffic to expand the bike network, as well as enhance pedestrian improvements at the intersections and provide more space along the greenway. So this is concluding our presentation, but if anyone's interested in checking out more about our plan, we have a link to the Pedestrian Mobility Plan website. It's on the DOT site. We also are planning on coming out with the pedestrian mobility plan document in 2024, so stay tuned for that. Also, if you have any questions or want to chat more about how we develop some of these data sets, you can reach out to our Deputy Director, Heidi Wolf. We have any questions?
Thank you, Carissa and Amy. Yeah, I'm gonna hopefully I'll start us off with a question I have, but in the meanwhile, any of our attendees, if you'd like to ask a question, feel free to enter it into the chat box, and we will be happy to share it with Carissa and Amy and maybe Heidi. There we go. Okay. So I was curious what the feedback has been from the community in terms of how you went about public outreach for the plan and what it seems like this would be something that folks would definitely have opinions on, since the sidewalk is so key both to the businesses and to the neighborhoods. So what's been the feedback so far?
Yeah, that's a great question, Adam. So we have reached out to a few different communities for feedback, and it's been, I feel like, relatively positive. We've actually had a few groups create their own websites about their streets related to the pedestrian mobility plan, and like take snapshots from the website advocating for more pedestrian space, which has been really fun to see. But that is something with the rollout of the pedestrian mobility plan document. I think we would like to do more targeted outreach to get feedback. If anyone does look at the pedestrian mobility plan demand map online and they think that their street is miscategorized, please reach out to us. We are happy to look at it and see why it might be showing up differently than what you see. Like we said, this is not a static document. It can change. And as I think a lot of us know, data is a good way to guide you to things, but it's not always correct, and you need to kind of vet it. So we're happy to take that feedback.
Really cool, really cool. Thank you. Yeah, I can see this would certainly be something that would be of national interest as well. I hope you guys are going down to the Transportation Research Board annual meeting in January in Washington, D.C. I'm sure a lot of folks would be really eager to hear more about this. So before I turn this over to Stephanie for some of the questions that I see are popping in, I just wanted to ask folks, and I apologize, Stephanie, for this will probably mess things up for you, but if folks would like to tell us where they're from in the chat box as well. I know we've got some NYMTC staff in the group, and you're welcome to also say you're NYMTC staff, but I'm kind of curious if we have folks from outside the New York City area, or where folks are coming from. But in any case, that's just a little bit of a sidebar. Stephanie, I'll turn it over to you for any additional questions we've got.
Thanks, Adam. We do have 3 questions so far. The first is, where on 7th Avenue is the super sidewalk photo that you displayed?
That was a photo from 8th Avenue, up by the Port Authority bus terminal. We also have a sidewalk on 9th Avenue, super sidewalk, newly on 9th Avenue, and we installed one last year on Lexington Avenue by Grand Central Terminal. So kind of those locations that see really vast numbers of people trying to get to those key transit hubs. But that is a typology that could be used around the city.
Second question was, any engagement from low income and underserved neighborhoods in planning development?
If I could jump in, my name is Heidi Wolf. I'm the Deputy Director of the Pedestrian Unit. I'm sorry, I missed the intro. I was having some technical troubles, but just to kind of rewind the community outreach question, as I see a couple of questions about that in the chat. We released the demand map as part of the streets plan that the agency put out, which was sort of the first introduction of the concept to the public. And when we did that, we also created a bit of a website. Releasing it in the streets plan kind of got out a little bit ahead of some of the community outreach that we had envisioned. At one point, we were talking about going to all 52 community boards and vetting this plan, and then we decided that that might be a little bit too ambitious. So we have done some more targeted things like tabling at certain, we do events around Earth Day and things like that. But the outreach we haven't done as much as we would want to, because we are still sort of finalizing what sort of a bit of a website, but we want to create much more of a document with a lot of the data and really what this means. Sometimes when you just provide a plan with design guidelines, but we don't have any of the the more draft and excuse me, confidential bits that we have about what sort of treatment types this would lead to and the areas that we want to work in the community. So when we were asked to do this presentation, we wanted to do it and we knew it was public and we're hoping it garners some interest, but it is sort of at a moment when we're still finalizing the document and haven't done the full breadth of community outreach that we would like to do. And we haven't seen like a tremendous amount of traffic to the website as of yet. So when we do have the final document, which we're hoping to have ready in spring of this year, I think we would like to do a larger push. And as Carissa said, the map is a living document. So even though that will be a report that we can share, the map will be continuously updated. So that's our approach and thinking about community outreach going forward. And if there's any local people that have groups that they think that we should target, we are working with our borough offices for those sorts of pieces. But if there's any suggestions here, feel free to drop them in the chat or send me an email and I can make note of that going forward.
Thank you so much. This next question, I think you pretty much addressed it. It's from a master's student at University of Utah in the City and Metropolitan Planning Program. They asked what specific community engagement techniques you've used for gaining feedback, which you did address. But the second part of that question was, where in the process did you use these techniques? So maybe you could elaborate a little bit about, where in the process, at the beginning or in the middle, or when did you start developing the website and all of that?
Yeah, when we the Streets Plan was the first sort of introduction. I think one of the only in-person events we did do was Earth Day in the Bronx, which was really sort of like a vetting of the map, like introducing the concept and asking anybody in the neighborhood to say like where they thought we got the demand map, basically the categorization of the sidewalks wrong. So that has sort of been less community driven at this point, because we really did want to have the data form the map and our knowledge about pedestrian need form the functional experience. So I think when we have the full package of these are the different sorts of treatments that one could request on this, and these are the priority tiers that's really been determined more by others in the agency, then we would have a full book that we could use at tabling events, we could have on our website, we could have in our borough offices, we could share with the elected officials, advocacy groups. So that's really been the approaches that we are presenting this, but we are presenting a lot of ideas that are not yet on our public facing website and are being put in a document that's less of a PowerPoint and more of a prose full document with like the graphics and additional maps and all of those things.
Thank you so much.
Could I just add one thing, which is Heidi just talked a lot about how we're going to work with the general public for this plan, but as we've been developing the plan internally, something that we've been focusing a lot is talking to different agencies. The sidewalk is often a place where everything is dumped, right? Whether it's a trash can, a new electric vehicle charging thing. So while we're looking forward to a coordination with the general public, we have been doing a lot of internal coordination with other city agencies, the Department of City Planning, Sanitation, many, and even internally in the DOT, thinking with our bikes team, with our teams that, work on bus lanes and all that kind of stuff, like making sure that we're all on the page about the need for a pedestrian clear path. So there's there's that external public participation, and then also interagency and our own agency kind of feedback process.
That's such a great point, Amy, and thank you for reminding me of that. It is really essential we get like buy-in from some of the other agencies that do have a lot of control over sidewalks through the Administrative Code of New York. Some other more targeted outreach we've done is around some of the pedestrian advocacy groups. We presented this plan to check peds, and we presented it to a few other advocates that work around people that have mobility impairments. So it's definitely been much more targeted.
Thank you both. Your invitation to solicit feedback has been answered. We've got someone just put in the chat. Hi, everyone. I work for Union Square Partnership, a Manhattan business improvement district. We have a few of the global corridors in our neighborhood. Please feel free to reach out to business improvement districts about this plan. So there's an opportunity for engagement right there. Thanks.
That's perfect. I think our team is working with the Union Square Partnership on Broadway with Ed Janoff. So yeah, maybe that would be, maybe your bid would be a good first step to present this plan to, or this some form of this presentation to. I'm happy to reach out to him about that.
And that is all that we have in the chat thus far.
All right, well then I'm going to thank Heidi, Carissa, Amy for this really great presentation. I'm looking forward to visiting that website myself, and I'm sure you're going to have lots of folks that are going to be eager to learn more. So thank you for letting us in kind of on the ground floor, I guess, as this develops, and we're looking forward to seeing how it goes and how it takes off. So thank you to our participants, for everyone who called in and has viewed the presentation. Again, to remind you, if you are seeking AICP credit, follow the link that's in the chat. And other than that, I want to wish you a terrific Thursday afternoon. Thank you, everyone. Take care.